If we think about plants' requirement for carbon dioxide as a source of carbon to build organic sugar molecules, it's easy but misleading to think, hey, maybe it's that the plants take in this carbon dioxide from the air. They use the carbon in the CO2 as a way to build organic molecules, and then they give back the remaining oxygen. This was the thinking of scientists before we understood the process of photosynthesis. We thought that's exactly it. Plants take in carbon dioxide, use the carbon, give back the oxygen. The hypothesis, however, had to be tested, right? So scientists did some really very elegant experiments where they took the two reactants for photosynthesis, the carbon dioxide and the water, and one at a time they labeled the oxygens in these molecules using radioactivity. And then they followed the radioactivity as the materials were being used for photosynthesis to see where that oxygen ended up. So for example, down below, we've got our two reactants, right? Carbon dioxide, and we've got water. In the first experiment, scientists took the oxygen and the carbon dioxide, labeled it with radioactivity, gave that carbon dioxide to photosynthetic organisms, and then followed to see where the radioactivity ended up. What they noticed is the radioactivity ended up in the carbohydrates that were being produced by the photosynthetic organism and in the water that was produced. But none of the radioactivity, if the oxygen and the carbon dioxide was labeled, ended up being released into the air as radioactive oxygen. So that disproved this hypothesis that plants take in the carbon dioxide, use the carbon, and release back the oxygen. So next the question is, well, where does that oxygen come from that plants release back into our atmosphere? So scientists then labeled the oxygen in the water instead with radioactivity, gave that radioactively labeled water to plants or photosynthetic organisms, and then they looked where did the radioactivity end up. And what they noted is all of that radioactivity ended up in the oxygen that was released back to the atmosphere. So really, what photosynthetic organisms do is they pull up water, they use the hydrogen atoms as a source of electrons, and then they release the oxygen back into the atmosphere. So really something that's somewhat counterintuitive to what we would expect, but all the while very interesting, and when we actually go through the process of photosynthesis, you'll see how much it actually makes sense. So that leads us now to a discussion of the background for photosynthesis, or sort of an overview, big picture. So lucky for us, cellular respiration took 3 stages to get through. Photosynthesis only takes 2. So we've got 2 stages. The first stage is a series of reactions that are called the light reactions, and these are coupled then with a second stage, which is the Calvin cycle. On this particular slide, we've got the text that summarizes the 2 different parts of photosynthesis, and then we'll go through it one more time with pictorial images on the next few slides. So first of all, the light reactions. This is where photosynthesis starts. Light reactions are carried out by the molecules that are embedded in the thylakoid membranes. This includes that chlorophyll pigment. The light reactions, hence the name, this is where light energy gets converted into chemical energy. Not directly to sugar molecules. Instead, that light energy is absorbed and used to make ATP, and also used to give electrons a little bit of a boost in energy, and these electrons are then carried by an electron carrier that's specific to photosynthesis. This electron carrier is NADPH in its reduced form. So you'll notice it's actually very similar to NADH, except there's a P in it, right? So to help you remember, you think P for photosynthesis, NADPH will be the full electron carrier that's used to carry electrons in photosynthesis. The electrons have to come from somewhere, though, right? And so the photosynthetic organism will take electrons from water. They split the water, they use the electrons from the hydrogen atoms, and then they release the oxygen back to the atmosphere. So that's it for the light reactions. Take light energy, use some of the energy to make ATP, use the rest of that energy to give electrons from water a boost in energy so that In the next half of photosynthesis, which is the Calvin cycle reactions, you can use those electrons to build complex organic molecules. So let's go through the Calvin reactions. These take place out in the stroma. So light reactions were in the thylakoid membrane. The Calvin cycle reactions are in the stroma. Remember, that's that fluid that's on the inside of the chloroplast that kind of bathes the thylakoid membrane. The Calvin cycle reactions will use the ATP made in the light reactions and the NADPH to convert carbon dioxide to the sugar G3P. So if anybody's ever told you, myself included, that photosynthesis makes glucose, yeah, I kind of lied to you a little bit. It doesn't directly make glucose, but it makes molecules of a sugar, a simpler sugar that's called G3P. Hopefully that rings a bell somewhere. If you think back to cellular respiration, G3P is one of the intermediate molecules right in the middle of glycolysis. So really, a cell that goes through photosynthesis to make G3P can effectively take two of these 3-carbon G3P molecules and stitch them together to make a 6-carbon glucose, right? So effectively, yes, photosynthesis does eventually make the simple sugars that are used to make the glucose that can then go off to be built into starches or cellulose or used by the cell as a source of fuel. Once the ATP is used and the NADPH is used, those empty molecules, the ADP and the inorganic phosphate and the NADP+, the equivalent of NAD+ in cell respiration, those all go back to the light reactions to pick up more energy. All right. So that's verbal or word version. Let's take a look at the pictorial version. Okay, so we are in the chloroplast, right? You've got the two inner and outer membranes that are smooth here in the chloroplast. Inside here in gray is the stroma, and then we've got the thylakoid membranes. They're organized into those little thylakoid sacs stacked into the grana, those little towers. The light reactions take place here within the thylakoid membrane. So light energy comes in. That light energy is used to take electrons from water, give them a boost in energy, and they're packed into and being carried by this electron carrier NADPH. This is the reduced form. The oxygen from the water is not needed, so that's going to leave and go off into the atmosphere. The light also that hits the thylakoids is used to link together ADP and inorganic phosphates to make ATP. That's only half the battle, right? We haven't made any sugar yet. All we did is we converted this light energy and we stored that light energy in the chemical form in ATP and those high energy electrons that we've given to NADPH. So now in the second half of photosynthesis that takes place out here in the stroma, we've got the Calvin cycle. Calvin cycle will use carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and then the energy from the ATP that was made by the light reactions, and the reducing power, those electrons from NADPH, to build organic molecules. When the ATP gets used up, the ADP and inorganic phosphate move to the light reactions to pick up more energy, so that's a cycle over and over again. And then the NADP+, once it had dropped off its electrons, goes back to the light reactions to pick up more electrons, to become NADPH, drops them off here in the Calvin cycle, goes back to get more, right? So over and over and over again. All right, so technically when you're looking at a chloroplast, you can think of it as a miniature solar-powered chemical factory, right? The thylakoid will transform light energy into that chemical energy that is ATP and NADPH, and then both of those molecules will be used to actually physically make the sugars. Now, if we're talking about photosynthesis, and we're going to get into the nitty-gritty details of how that light energy is absorbed and used, we have to talk about light a little bit. A little bit of this will be review from lab, for example. When we looked at spectrophotometry, we went through light a little bit, so hopefully not all of this will be new to you. All right, so light, we know that it's a form of electromagnetic energy. Right? It's a form of kinetic energy, and it travels in these rhythmic waves. If we measure the distance between adjacent crests, that distance is considered the wavelength. Right? How long is that distance between the two tops of waves that are next to each other. And the wavelength will determine the type of electromagnetic energy that you're dealing with. Not all electromagnetic energy is the same. And so down in this figure, we've got the whole spectrum of electromagnetic energy. The energy that has the longest wavelength, these are the radio waves. So these guys can get, close to a kilometer in length when you get, you try to measure the distance between those adjacent waves. The longer the wavelength, the lower the frequency, right? The less frequently those waves come. Also, the longer the wavelength, the lower the frequency, the lower the energy that's associated with this kind of electromagnetic energy. On the other end of the spectrum, here we've got our gamma rays, for example. These have the shortest wavelength, and so these waves come with great frequency, and they also have a lot of energy associated with them. Now, visible light, the kind of light that plants, for example, use for photosynthesis, visible light is here, right in the middle of the electromagnetic spectrum. And so you can see it spread out down here. The reds have the longer wavelengths, they have the lower energy associated with them, and then the blues and the violets are going to have the shorter wavelength, higher frequency, higher energy. Not only does light travel in waves, but it also behaves as if it were made out of discrete particles. And we call these quote-unquote particles photons. There's nothing tangible there, you can't touch it, but this is the way that it behaves. It behaves as if it were a little packet of energy. So for example, red light, these photons, these packets of energy, don't have nearly as much energy as the photons of light of the violet and blue light, right? So the amount of light in a photon corresponds to the wavelength of light that you're talking about. So reds, photons have less energy, and the blues, violets, those photons have greater energy. Now, the reason why we see color, right? So white light is made out of the entire visible spectrum, the whole rainbow, Roy G. Biv, right? And pigment molecules, or pigments are substances. They're molecules that, based on their chemical structure, can absorb different wavelengths of this visible light. And not all pigments are built the same. Depending on their molecular structure, some pigments absorb certain wavelengths of light and others absorb different wavelengths of light. So if we take a look down here at the chloroplast, right, we've got our thylakoid membranes. Remember, the thylakoid membranes have that chlorophyll pigment. Chlorophyll appears green because chlorophyll is really good at absorbing all wavelengths of light, right? So the whole entire visible spectrum except for green. Chlorophyll can't really absorb green at all. And so green light will either be reflected from the chlorophyll or passes right through. And that light that gets reflected or transmitted goes to our eyes, through our pupil, to the back of our retina, to the photoreceptors that detect that light energy and send a signal to our brain saying, oh, hey, that's green light. So for example, I've got a red pen here. This red pen has pigment molecules in the plastic, and these pigment molecules are really good at absorbing all wavelengths of light except for red, right? So the red light makes its way either through the material or bounces off the material, goes to our eyes, so that we can see this pen as being a red color.